Good evening, and hello again. Today, we are traveling to the Japanese islands to trace the long and fascinating story of their ancient past. How did small communities of farmers and fishers transform into powerful clans and kingdoms? What role did nature, the mountains, and the sea play in shaping their culture? And how did the myths of gods and ancestors intertwine with real history to form the foundation of Japan? We will look at the Jomon and Yayoi periods, the rise of the early emperors, the spread of Buddhism, and the forging of traditions that endured for centuries. This is a story of change and continuity, of battles and beliefs, of a people seeking their place between the land and the sea. As always, I'm very interested to know what part of the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are here to fall asleep or just to learn something new, I'm glad you've joined me. Now, let's begin. If you open Japan's oldest books, you begin with gods standing on a celestial bridge, stirring the ocean with a jeweled spear. The brine drips, hardens, and becomes an island. The gods descend to see what they have made. This is the tone of the Kojiki, compiled in 712, and the Nihon Shoki, completed in 720. They are part family album, part origin story, written to explain how the world began, how the Japanese islands came to be, and why a certain line of rulers should sit on the throne. Both works were products of the court, with an eye on politics as much as piety. Yet they remain invaluable. They preserve the earliest names, rites, and how the early Japanese imagined their place in the universe. The divine couple, Izanagi and Izanami, were tasked with giving the land form. They birthed the islands and the first deities, or kami. Tragedy arrives early. Izanami dies giving birth to the god of fire, and Izanagi descends into the shadowy land of the dead to retrieve her. He fails, flees, and purifies himself in a river. From this act of ablution emerged the three great deities who would shape the future narrative. Amaterasu, the sun goddess, emerges from his left eye. Tsukuyomi, the moon god, from his right. Susanoo, the storm god, from his nose. The symbolism is clear, even if the details are strange. Light, time, weather, a complete working sky. Amaterasu becomes the heart of the narrative. She hides in a cave after one of Susanoo's outbursts, and the world goes dark. The gods lure her out with a mirror and a ritual dance. It is not a modern diplomatic solution, but it works. Light returns, order returns, and the mirror that tempted her out becomes one of the three sacred objects that anchor imperial rule. Along with a curved jewel and a sword, it would form the regalia of later emperors. You can still see the sites tied to this history in living practice. The grand shrine at Ise is dedicated to Amaterasu. Its main halls are rebuilt every 20 years in a meticulous cycle that preserves skills and materials as much as the structures themselves. The craft is as important as the sanctuary. The sword has its own legends, including the slaying of a multi-headed serpent in Izumo. The jewel, a polished magatama, speaks to a very old love for curved beads that traces its roots to prehistoric graves. At this point, the chronicles make a pivot. The gods hand the earth over to human rulers. The descent of Ninigi, grandson of Amaterasu, brings the regalia to the human world. His great-great-grandson, Jimmu, becomes the first emperor. The date given for his ascension is 660 BCE. No one accepts this date as literal fact, as one might record a coronation today. But the point is not the number. It is the continuity. The emperor's declaration that he is from the sun. This claim proves very useful in a society stitching together clans and regions and needing a single shining story. If you want to see how religion, power, and landscape joined, the early myths are a useful guide. The islands are not merely places on a map. They are the handiwork of gods with very human temperaments. Rivers need to be appeased. Volcanoes demand respect. Mountains are homes for spirits who prefer proper offerings and neat rituals. Shinto, the way of the gods, the native way, grows out of this view. It is not a book religion. There are no prophets dictating chapters. There are shrines in groves, by springs, and on peaks, priests who oversee the rites, and a language of purity and pollution that touches everything, from harvest festivals to the start of a building project. The court that created the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki had practical goals. By the early 8th century, the rulers in Nara were adopting Chinese-style administration, law codes, and a city laid out on a grid. They needed an origin story that matched that scale. A divine lineage did two things at once. It made the throne more than a chair in a palace. It also allowed the court to fold local cults into the national narrative. The shrines of mountain and harvest deities could be recognized as guardians of the realm, and their priests could be brought into a network of courtly ranks and duties. In this way, politics did not replace religion, it became its partner. The myths also remember rivalry and regional pride in their own way. Izumo, on the Sea of Japan coast, features prominently in the tales of Susanoo and the early yielding of the land to the celestial line. You can visit Izumo Taisha today, one of the oldest and most revered shrines, with its enormous rope, shimenawa, and quiet grounds. The story says that the earthly rulers ceded the land in exchange for divine favor and a great shrine. Read politically, the story acknowledges that other bloodlines mattered and that reconciliation was wiser than erasure. The court was weaving a tapestry, not cutting new cloth. None of this stops the myths from being lively. Susanoo is a difficult brother who throws a flayed horse into his sister's weaving hall. Amaterasu is proud, easily hurt, and susceptible to flattery with a mirror. The gods argue, laugh, and sometimes misbehave. The tone is often closer to a family saga than a sermon, which is perhaps why these stories endured. They sound like people, even when they are stars. Archaeology gives this scene a deeper backdrop. Long before the chronicles were written, people on the islands were firing clay, fishing the coasts, and moving through forests rich with nuts and game. Magatama beads appear in graves over centuries, a bright echo of the jewel in the regalia. Mirrors and swords become prized in elite tombs. When the texts name the mirror, the sword, and the jewel as anchors of rule, they are also naming things people already valued. Symbols only work if they feel familiar in the hand. One more point is worth noting. The early chronicles were compiled during a time of intense exchange with the continent. Buddhism had arrived from Korea. Writing was borrowed from China. Law codes and calendars were studied and copied. Into this world, the court chose to frame the emperor not as the son of a foreign heaven, but as the inheritor of the sun that rises over these very islands. It is a careful balance. Learn abroad, rule at home. The result is a mythical package that is local in flavor and broad in application. If you stand at the Issei Shrine on a quiet morning, you see cypress logs silvered with time, fresh thatch on the roofs, gravel raked smooth, and a line of visitors who bow before proceeding. Outside the main compound, carpenters are already seasoning wood and preparing the next shrine because the calendar insists on renewal. This is as close a summary as possible of ancient Japanese belief. Honor the past, rebuild it, keep the craft alive, and do not pretend that permanence is the goal. The sun rises, the shrine is rebuilt, the story is told again. Set the myths aside for a minute and step into a smoke-tinged village on a cool morning many thousands of years ago. A ring of low thatched roofs sits nestled among nut trees. A river slides past the backs of the homes, where salmon move like silver thoughts. This is Jomon, Japan. There are no kings, no palaces, just communities that learned how to stay put without being farmers in the strict sense, and who somehow managed to maintain this way of life longer than most civilizations have existed. Archaeologists named them for their pots. Jomon means cord-marked, a simple description of pottery imprinted with twisted rope while the clay was soft. The name is humble, the achievement is not. These are some of the oldest ceramic vessels on Earth. The earliest examples appear more than 15,000 years ago. They were fired in open hearths and used for stewing fish or boiling nuts. By the middle of the Jomon story, around 2000 BCE, the pots explode into extravagance. Tongues of clay flame up the rims. Loops twist and coil. The vessels look like bonfires that decided to harden. Some were practical, some were ceremonial. All tell you that these villagers had time and taste, and the desire to turn a cooking pot into something that could stop you in your tracks. People who make things like this do not move from camp to camp. Jomon people built pit dwellings, round or oval rooms dug into the soil and roofed with timbers and thatch. A hearth burned in the center. The smoke cured meat and probably drove the mosquitoes crazy. In winter, the floor stayed warm. In summer, it stayed cool. Storage pits dotted the village edges. The Jomon people filled them with acorns and chestnuts after leaching the bitterness in running water. Dried fish from weirs set across streams, and roots and bulbs dug from nearby wetlands. They hunted deer and boar using stone-tipped arrows and spears. They fished the lakes and coasts with bone hooks and barbed harpoons. They wove nets and weighted them with shaped stones. The scene is not one of romantic wilderness. It is a managed landscape. There's strong evidence that people managed chestnut groves and helped useful plants flourish closer to home. It is not yet farming as it would come later, but it is a sustained drive towards security. If you want to see what mattered to them besides dinner, pick up a dogu. These small clay figurines are found from Hokkaido to Kyushu, with goggle-like eyes, hips that speak of fertility, and bodies carved with patterns that might be clothing or perhaps symbols. Some were neatly broken at the limbs and left in dwellings or pits. This deliberate act feels much like ritual, a way to ward off sickness or misfortune by destroying a substitute. The Jomon toolkit is a lesson in patience and craft. Stone axes were polished to a sheen. Grinding stones processed seeds and pigments. Bone awls punched hides for clothing and nets. Woven baskets were so fine that people applied lacquer tree sap to the surface to make them hard and glossy. The earliest use of lacquer in the world comes from these islands. The result is not a quart tea bowl, but a basket that can carry weight without rotting in the rain. The craft was not limited to what the village could find underfoot. Shiny black obsidian from Nagano traveled far along river routes. Beautiful green jade from the Niigata moved the other way. These paths tell us of trade and contact. Even a small settlement knew of the neighbors 2 valleys over, and those neighbors knew of others beyond them. The archipelago was a network of exchange long before rice paddies stitched the lowlands together. The shoreline was constantly changing beneath their feet. As the ice sheets retreated, the seas rose and drowned plains, then formed new coasts. Shell middens trace these changes. These long mounds of oyster and clam shells are the Jomon archive. Inside them are fish bones and bird bones, charcoal from the hearths, plant seeds, broken pots, worked antler, and sometimes the contracted remains of someone who lived there. Many Jomon communities buried their dead in or near the places where they slept and cooked. The living and the dead shared space. This practice gave the villages a memory deeper than any living person could carry. Because Jomon lasted so long, there is no single snapshot that fits every century. Scholars divide the period into phases to speak of the changes with some precision. In Middle Jomon, around 2000 BCE, population swells, villages get larger, the pottery gets bold, and large communal structures appear at sites like Sanai Maruyama in the far north. There you can stand among reconstructed pit houses and a great six-post tower and sense how a settlement of hundreds of people once functioned as a single organism. Later, the climate grows colder and wetter. Game shifts its range. Nuts are less reliable. Villages shrink. The pottery adopts quieter shapes, with straighter rims and simpler bodies. The culture bends, but does not break. Throughout all these centuries, there remains a distinct love for the polished kama-shaped bead called the magatama. They appear in graves and caches, carved from jade or agate, and sometimes glass when it becomes available. It is satisfying that the early myths later chose the mirror, the sword, and the jewel as the tokens of rule, because for the Jomon, mirrors were rare, swords were prized weapons, and jewels were things one could hold and admire. Symbols grow out of habits. Not every region kept pace. Hokkaido clung to hunting and fishing, even as rice farmers arrived in the south. The Pacific coast and the inland seas fostered different diets and demanded different toolkits. Yet a style of pottery and the presence of familiar tools wove the islands into a recognizable Jomon world. You could trace the pattern from Kyushu to Tohoku and see relatives at work. Contact with the continent was a fact, not a theory. Occasional voyages bring people, whether they intend to or not. Storms carry canoes from one shore to another. Obsidian and jade prove long-distance paths inside the islands. Shell ornaments from warm waters turn up far north. Some influences may have arrived through stories as well as objects. What the Jomon people did not do was adopt large-scale farming. This choice, or perhaps this lack of choice, is what gives the period its character. Communities found ways to feed themselves and stay put without the blanket fields that defined life in so many other parts of the world. The last centuries before new ideas from Korea arrived are full of small signs of tension and invention. Fishing weirs become more complex. Settlements choose spots with better access to diverse foods. Storage practices improve. At the same time, the extravagant flame-rimmed pots decrease. House forms in some areas change to accommodate wetter soil. You can almost hear the conversation at the village fire. Will the deer return to the low hills? Will the salmon run be strong? Do we go to the coast to trade this year, or wait for them to come inland? The answers changed decade to decade, but the ability to adapt was learned over millennia. When rice farming and metal tools began to diffuse from the continent around the 3rd century BCE, they did not wipe out Jomon in an instant. The change was gradual and uneven. In many places, the new customs layered over the old. A farm woman might still coil a pot with cord markings because that is how her mother taught her. A metal blade might sit beside a polished stone axe because the axe still did its job well. In the north, the Jomon way continued in what scholars call epi-Jomon. In the south, it merged into what we call Yayoi. This shift tells us that cultures pass the baton. They don't disappear behind a curtain. It is useful to anchor these facts in human scale. Imagine a woman pressing a cord into the clay while her child watches intently and tries a small pattern on a scrap. Imagine a man walking a ridge trail with obsidian to trade and a story ready to exchange with the first person he meets. Imagine a group leaching acorns in a stream and singing in a rhythm that eases the heavy work. Imagine a small clay figure lifted to the firelight and then carefully broken while a sick person lies wrapped and waiting. These are not echoes of people who failed to progress. They are portraits of people who learned to live, using the gifts of their place for an astonishingly long period of time. By 2000 BCE, which can stand as a marker for Middle Jomon, Japan already contained communities that had mastered the art of staying. They built houses that worked with the weather, invented pottery that was both useful and bold, traded across mountains and bays, and developed rites that laced life with meaning. The chronicles that would later be written in Nara speak of jewels and swords given by the gods. The ground beneath Nara holds the beads and blades of the people who lived that meaning every day. Step out of a Jomon village into a Yayoi village, and you feel the soil change beneath your feet. The forest is thinner. The air smells of wet soil and chaff. You hear water moving in the ditches. People stand ankle-deep in a square of shallow water, planting young rice shoots into the mud with an even rhythm. That sight tells you almost everything. The Yayoi period begins when wet rice culture arrives on the islands from the continent, most likely via the Korean peninsula, and it alters almost every part of daily life. Villages get larger. Time is measured by planting and harvest. New tools gleam in the sunlight. Where the Jomon people lived well off the forests and water, the Yayoi people redraw the landscape and commit themselves to it with dikes and shovels. The precise timing is still debated with the fastidiousness that archaeologists love, but a good rule of thumb is this. By around the 3rd century BCE, rice paddies are a fact in northern Kyushu and moving east up the river plains. You can see their ghosts at sites like Toro in Shizuoka, where the outline of the fields is still visible in the soil. At Toro, the remnants of ditches and embankments show the geometry of labor. Farmers cut channels to divert streams, segmented the fields like a patchwork quilt, and built small sluices to control the flow. This was no casual pastime. Rice needs warm summers and careful watering. It demands teams of people who agree on when to flood and when to drain. It implies leaders who can coordinate, neighbors who can cooperate, and rules that prevent everything from devolving into shouting. In short, the first rice paddies bring the first real politics to the village level. Rice changes the buildings too. Pit dwellings remain, but a new structure rises above them. The stilt house emerges, with deeply driven posts and a floor raised high above the ground. The steps are narrow and often removable. Gaps between the floorboards allow air to circulate. It's a clever solution against rodents and dampness. Inside the barn stand jars sealed with plant fiber to keep insects out. These jars may look plain next to some Jomon flame pots, but they are tightly lidded and trustworthy. Food security is the point. The toolkit is transformed. Wooden shovels and hoes are still everywhere, but now there are iron blades that cut and turn the soil with a sharp bite. At first, iron is imported as finished goods or ingots. Later, local working of iron bloom happens. Bronze arrives too, but it takes a different path. Iron becomes the metal for tools. Bronze becomes the metal for ceremony and show. Archaeologists find bronze spearheads and swords that look beautiful but are impractical for sustained use in the field. They also find bronze mirrors and the famous bronze bells called dotaku. The bells are tall and thin, with flanges and handles. Many are decorated with images showing deer, boats, birds, and possibly farmers in the fields. They are almost always found buried on hilltops or in groups away from settlements, as if communities brought them out for rituals and then returned them to the earth when the ritual was complete. If you want a sense of Yayoi beliefs in a single object, the dotaku are hard to beat. They chime with the sound of coordinated labor and seasons that begin and end with the first sheen of green on the fields. Pottery calms in form and increases in functionality. Yayoi pots are often thinner, smoother, and more regularly shaped than Jomon pots. Cord markings give way to burnished surfaces and simple bands. The forms are suited for cooking grain and storing liquids. This is kitchenware for everyday labor. Villages grow larger and are fortified. At Yoshinogari in Kyushu, you can walk through the reconstruction of long palisades, watchtowers, and moats that once surrounded a large settlement. This is not the architecture of people who expect all their neighbors to be friendly. When food is stored in barns and land is divided into ditches and plots, disputes become sharper. Prestige goods, such as iron blades or bronze mirrors, also invite envy. Burial evidence shows clear social stratification. Some graves contain only bare necessities. Others hold fine jewelry, weapons, and mirrors that came from across the sea. This gap hints at the rise of chieftains who can command labor, collect surpluses, host feasts, and wage war when necessary. Textiles become more common. Spindle whorls and loom weights are found in Yayoi lairs across the archipelago. Hemp and rami provide sturdy fibers for cloth. With cloth comes status that can be worn. A chieftain has robes that declare his rank. A priestess has garments set aside for ritual. Trade and travel stitch the islands and the continent together. Obsidian and jade still move within Japan, but now there are iron tools and bronze mirrors from the mainland, glass beads glittering in the sun, and perhaps even ideas on how a village should be governed. The Han commanderies on the Korean peninsula serve as bridges for goods and news. Contacts with the continent also bring writing, at first as marks on imported objects, and then as an idea that will reconstruct Japanese culture at the root. The spread of rice and metal is uneven. Northern Kyushu and the inland sea adopt the new ways early. The Kinki region fills with villages that will matter for centuries. The Kanto Plain begins to change along its many rivers. Hokkaido holds on to hunting and fishing far longer and follows its own path. Everywhere, the same question is being asked, with different accents. How far do we flood the field? Who will build the next ditch? Where will we store the harvest? Who speaks for the village when strangers arrive at the gate? You can watch knowledge harden into custom in the shovel marks and the layers of footprints that archaeologists study. A poorly placed embankment fails, and the people learn. The next one holds. A community tries a new planting sequence and learns that it better suits the rains. The calendar that matters now is not just the calendar of moons and the run of the fish. It is the calendar of plowing days, planting days, and the first bend of the stalks under their own weight. Festivals cluster around these moments. Music and bells carry over the fields on warm evenings as people thank the gods for the water that came and the insects that stayed away. The practical and the sacred share the same ditch embankment. The shift from Jomon to Yayoi is sometimes presented as a clean break between foragers and farmers. The soil tells a more subtle story. There are villages where Jomon-style pots continue alongside the new forms. There are graves where magatama beads lie with iron knives. There are polished stone tools in the same layer as a rusty sickle. People do not change their identity as quickly as they change a spear for a hoe. People carry habits forward and adapt them to new work. Over centuries, the new way becomes the old way. And that is how tradition is formed. Stand finally at the edge of a Yayoi field at sunset, and you can almost count the consequences. Rice fields create a surplus. The surplus supports specialists. Specialists create better tools and finer jewelry. Better tools and finer jewelry make leaders more impressive. Leaders organize the defense, the pilgrimages, and the law. Ditches and embankments teach people to plan as a group and make decisions that bind everyone. These habits do not stop at the village gate. They scale up. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, powerful clan centers begin to emerge in Kinai and northern Kyushu. Some leaders call themselves kings. They send ambassadors and gifts across the sea and receive gifts in return. A famous queen will soon step onto this stage and hold many of these threads in her hands. If you walk the irrigation ditches of the Yayoi countryside into the 3rd century AD, the scene begins to thicken with rank and ceremony. Rice stockpiles grow. Chieftains get bolder. Villages surround their borders with moats and palisades. Trade routes hum with glass beads, bronze mirrors, and iron blades. In this crowded landscape, we begin to hear names. This is the great shift. For the first time, Japan enters the written record, and it does so through the eyes of its neighbors. Out of this bustle, one figure comes into focus. Her name is Himiko. Chinese texts say that after many years of struggle among rival chieftains, the people chose a woman of great ritual skill to rule. The year of her emergence is often pegged to the late 2nd century. She never married, rarely appeared in public, and ruled through male relatives while consulting with the spirits herself. It's hard not to imagine a quiet compound of screens and courtyards where a queen shaman speaks to envoys through an inner room and listens to reports of ditches, barns, and feuding. Himiko's realm is called Yamatai in the Chinese records. Where it was located has been debated for over a century. What matters to our story is that she rallied enough of these small countries to send an official embassy to the Wei court in 238 AD. That mission was a turning point. The Wei emperor sent back gifts and a letter recognizing Himiko as a friendly ruler of Wa. Among the gifts were bronze mirrors, silks, and a seal with a purple ribbon. The mirrors were no trivial matter. They were the premier prestige good of the time, cast in bronze, polished to a gleam, and decorated with crisp patterns on the back. They traveled hand to hand with a power that iron sickles never possessed. The Chinese records also mention that Himiko dealt with a troublesome neighbor named Kunu and petitioned Wei for aid, which suggests her power had limits and that she was clever enough to seek support beyond the islands. She ruled into her 70s, dying around 248 AD. The Chronicle says that a great mound over 100 paces across was built for her, and that over 100 servants followed her into death. That detail has the chilling tone of fact. It also gives us an anchor in the landscape. Somewhere a new kind of burial was emerging that spoke with earth, not clay. Tombs of this scale emerge in Japan just as the texts say Himiko was alive. They are called Kofun, which simply means old mound, but many of them are not simple at all. The most distinctive are keyhole-shaped when viewed from above, with a circular rear portion connected to a square or trapezoidal front. A moat often surrounds them. Stone chambers inside hold the dead and their possessions. Clay figures called haniwa stand on the slopes. Images of people, animals, and houses, as if the living world was installed in careful miniature to keep the dead company. The earliest of these tombs rise in the Nara Basin and nearby regions during the 3rd century. The largest, belonging to a later generation of rulers, stretch for hundreds of meters and consume the labor of entire districts. One, traditionally ascribed to a 5th century sovereign, is longer than many modern airports. The scale is the message. It is tempting to point to the largest of the early mounds and say, Himiko lies here. The most famous candidate is the Ashikaga mound in Nara, long and graceful. What is important for us is that after Himiko, mound building becomes the hallmark of rule, and a new political order blossoms. We can sketch out that order. Power first centralized in the Kinai region, around what is now Nara and Osaka, where the wide plains and river deltas made rice and people plentiful. Clan leaders intermarried, fought, and aligned themselves. From among them, a leading bloodline rose that began to call itself not just first among equals, but the ruler of the archipelago. The Chinese continued to receive envoys, now not only from Kyushu chieftains, but from a king who called himself the ruler of Wa. In one 5th century letter, he even claimed a grandiose continental title. The key domestic tool of this ascent was the Kofun. To build it, you needed a surplus, a foreman, and a reason to command hundreds of laborers for months. The mound made the chieftain, and the chieftain made the mound. What went into these burials tells us of rank and beliefs. Mirrors gleam in the torchlight as the chambers are opened. Iron swords with distinctive ring pommels lie by the dead. Sets of armor rest where retainers once stood. Strands of magatama beads curve around the chests. Haniwa stand in ranks on the slopes. Some are shaped like warriors with crossbelts. Some are musicians. Some are simple cylinders that seem to demarcate zones, like a rope in a shrine. Society at this time had its laws. Rice provided food security, but the ambitions of the chieftains meant constant preparation for conflict. At Yoshinogari, the reconstructed watchtowers and long fences show a community on alert and organized. Excavations elsewhere find arrowheads stuck in bone and burned layers that speak of raids. Yet those same sites yield loom weights, spindle whorls, and fine combs. The production of cloth was growing. High-ranking women wore robes that advertised it. Rank meant the right to speak in councils and the obligation to host great communal meals when the harvest came in. The power to command labor carried with it the duty to be generous. In a world without coins, reputation and reciprocity were as good as money. Ritual held this world in balance. The local gods of water and harvest did not disappear when a new paramount clan came onto the scene. They were adopted. Priests and shrine guardians found their place in the new order. When you want to rule villages that have their own gods, it is wise to honor those gods and add your ancestors to the company rather than push them out. By the start of the 5th century, it looked to outside observers as though there was a unified court that could, at least, claim to speak for the many. It's useful to stand at the edge of a keyhole-shaped mound and look out. You see the plain, the low hills where the haniwa were fired. You see smaller mounds like squires to a lord. Further out, beyond the fields, you see a row of stilt buildings that must be storehouses, and next to them, long halls where the chieftain entertained. A funeral here would have gathered people for miles. The ground would have shaken with the stamping of feet and the dull thud of soil emptied from baskets as the mound rose like a slow wave. When it was all done, the haniwa were set out in neat order, and the moat was filled to a shining surface. The tomb was no place to hide. It was a public proclamation. The story of Himiko is part history, part mirror trick. We know her because China recorded her. We can sense her because later Japan remembered women with ritual authority who stand at the head of bloodlines and speak for the gods in sanctuaries that still matter. We can locate her because mounds of a new scale appear when the text says she died. By the mid-3rd century, a political culture had formed that would dominate the next century. It is frank about rank. It is calm about monumentality. It reaches across the sea for prestige and sends letters with seals. It buries its leaders in earthworks that order the skyline. It retains the village gods and adds its own radiance around a central bloodline. The archipelago is not yet thinking with the legal codes and ministries of a continental court, but it is thinking on a larger scale. The stage is set for the Yamato state to step forward and use both the myth and the mound to turn the many small countries into one unified realm. Walk south from the old river plains of the Kenai Plain on a clear morning, and you begin to notice the round hills that aren't quite hills. Their slopes are faced with pale stones. Around them, from the air, a shallow moat gleams. Some of these tumuli are shaped like an ancient key laid upon green cloth, a circle connected to a squared front by a narrow neck. They are tombs, and they tell you that something new has happened in Japan. Someone can command enough labor to move entire landscapes, heap earth higher than the tree line, and populate the slopes with rows of clay figures that daze eternally at the horizon. This is the world of early Yamato. It is the Kofun world, the old mounds, where power is measured by the weight of the hill. The shift didn't happen in a vacuum. By the late 3rd century, the rice fields of the Yayoi country had multiplied, tying villages together with long chains of ditches and obligations. Chieftains who could organize the water and settle the quarrels found it easier to call on people to clear forest and raise palisades. Trade in iron, mirrors, and glass beads made certain houses shine. Out of this landscape of capable local leaders, a few bloodlines in the Kenai region began to rise above the rest. They intermarried with neighboring clans, gathered allies, and made the final move that separates the important from the ruling. They turned death into a proclamation. Build a mound so big no one can miss it, and you have told the living exactly how the world is ordered. Archaeologists can read these mounds as a librarian reads book spines across a room. The earliest keyhole mounds rise in the Nara Basin shortly after the time the Chinese chroniclers note the death of the shaman queen Himiko. The Ashikaga mound is a famous candidate for that era. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the mounds swelled to astonishing sizes. The great cluster of Mozu and Furuichi mounds near Osaka form a city of the dead, with avenues of water and land that once required tens of thousands of hands. The Daisen Kofun, attributed by later tradition to an emperor named Mintoku, stretches for almost 500 meters from edge to edge. It's hard to stand next to such a thing and not feel you are in the presence of a message. Unpack the earth inside one of these tombs, and the message continues in the objects. The slope is often lined with river stones the size of a fist that once gleamed white in the sun. This is called fukiishi. Standing on the slopes are haniwa, clay cylinders in neat ranks at first, later joined by figures taking human and animal form. There are haniwa warriors with shields, house facades with tiled eaves, chickens, boats, saddled horses, even musicians. They feel less like toys than like a small census of the world that was ordered around the person inside. Stone-lined chambers hold lacquered coffins. Mirrors of cast bronze lie ready to catch a light that will never reach them. Swords rest at the hip, and plates of armor sit in ordered stacks. Curved magatama beads form strands across the chest and wrists. You can hear the economy in these objects. There are iron blades that speak of artisans and trade routes. There are mirrors that speak of continental connection. There are jewels that signal rank so clearly that even 15 centuries later, you feel who would have spoken first in the House of Council. The Kofun itself was a project plan enacted in the dirt. Moats were dug first, and their contents were cast inward to raise the first layers. Workers laid the stones to keep the edges firm. The platforms were tamped down in layers, like a stepped pyramid of clay. When the chamber was built and the coffin and objects set inside, earth was heaped to close the inner room, and the long, final rises of the mound began, all with baskets and hand tools. The clay figures were set in their ranks, the moat was filled, and the embankments trimmed. On the day of the burial, the space around the Kofun would have been a city of the living. Villages emptied into a procession. Drums and bells sounded. The dead chieftain or queen was carried up a path lined with reeds. Offerings were made, oaths were sworn. A new leader took a place on a viewing platform, and the crowd saw exactly where the line of authority ran. The ability to do this created Yamato. This name, which first names a region, becomes shorthand for the people capable of commanding the labor of many clans and presenting themselves as the natural center of the islands. The early Yamato court was not like a Chinese palace with rows of administrators in silk reading law codes. It was a circle of powerful kinship groups called uji, clans, bound by marriage, oath, and a sense that the gods had entrusted them with the management of the rice fields between the mountains and the sea. There were titles of rank that later centuries remembered as kabane. Some clans were remembered as omi, some as muraji, each with their own duties and privileges. Around them were occupational groups called bei, who produced cloth, iron, timber, or ceremonial goods, and were attached to the noble houses as their economic backbone. Horses arrived during this time, and with them the pace of war and travel changes. Saddle plates, bits, and stirrups begin to be found in 5th century tombs. The stirrup is a quiet revolution. A rider who can brace his feet can fire a strong bow from a moving horse and stay in the saddle. It turns skirmishes that used to be close quarters and on foot into contests where leaders could decide the day's outcome at a full gallop. Mounted elites could move quickly between river valleys, check on distant storehouses, and appear on the ridges above rebellious neighbors with alarming speed. If you ask how a single bloodline in Kenai could stitch together wider territories, the answer lies partly in the measured thud of hooves. Connections across the sea strengthen. From Korea come tools, armor designs, ideas on how to lay out storehouses and halls, even skilled migrants who establish furnaces and forges. From the southern Chinese courts come letters and titles for people who called themselves the kings of Wa. In the histories of the southern dynasties, there is a sequence known in Japan as the 5 Kings of Wa. For much of the 5th century, a line of Yamato rulers sent embassies seeking recognition and military titles that would boost their status both abroad and at home. A ruler welcomed at the Chinese court can return home and display the seals and silks, and ask his rivals to look again at who should lead the spring levy. One symbol of this international moment is preserved in a legendary weapon, the 7-branched sword, held in a shrine in Nara, whose inscription records a gift from a Korean king to a leader on the islands in the 4th century. Even if scholars dispute the exact reading, the blade as an object says that rank and gift were carefully passed across the straits. Culture deepened at court. Potters in this era began firing a new, high-temperature grayware called su, thrown on a wheel and fired in climbing kilns. Su ware is plain and durable, and quickly spread among elite houses. Shrines of great age took their shape in these centuries. At Ise on the coast, where the sun goddess was honored, carpenters formed cypress beams and thatched roofs in a style that turned simplicity into a kind of perfection. And the practice of periodic rebuilding took root as a way to keep the sanctuary forever new and forever old. At Idzumo in the north, the tall shrine of the turbulent deity preserved the memory of an older regional pride and was brought into the orbit of the ascending court. The presence of haniwa is one of the most human touches of the age. The earliest are simple cylinders that likely marked boundaries or terraces. Soon, there are soldiers with broad belts and straight backs, musicians with drums, women with textured hair and layered clothing, horses in simple harness, and houses that look like architectural models. They were set in rows and groups along the edges of the mounds and on the platforms. Many of them possess a serene, almost observant expression. The clay figures feel like the successors to the tomb servants of earlier times, signs of a retinue that remains on duty. We have only scattered written clues from Japan itself in this period, but the larger picture is strong. The Yamato lineage unified in Kinai. It leveraged the surplus through a network of allied clans and attached workers. It made law the old way, by putting the right people in the right places and telling stories that persuaded the rest that this order was blessed by the gods. By the late 5th century and into the 6th, the polity that began as a circle of assertive clans had become something resembling a court. A handful of family names carry familiar offices. The largest Kofun begin to diminish in size as rulers shift their focus from proclaiming rank in death to managing rank among the living. Stand at the edge of one of the keyhole mounds at Furuichi on a late afternoon, and you see how it all worked. On one side, the village goes about its business among fields squared by channels. On the other, a line of trees shades a path where pack horses head toward a storehouse. Across the moat, the slope of stones rises to a leveled terrace, and above it, the round back of the mound fills the sky. Everything in sight is made by the same community. The rice that fills the jar, the iron that cuts the stalk, the hands that dress the dead, and the earth that is heaped over them are all parts of the same economy and the same belief. It is this early Yamato learned to organize and present. Ambassadors are still crossing the sea, but now there are conversations about a new faith and a new teaching. The tools are ready for a leap that will change everything. Writing will take root. Buddhism will arrive with monks and texts and art that travels with the faith. History will shift from earthworks to temples, and from haniwa to wooden halls gleaming with gold leaf and lacquer. If you arrived at a Yamato court gathering in the early 7th century, you would notice something new among the lacquered trays and polite bows. A small bronze image of a serene figure sits on a pedestal, its hands folded in a gesture of peace, the folds of its robe cascading in measured lines. There is incense. You hear whispers of sutra recitation in a language no one here grew up speaking. Courtiers still exchange poetry, and local gods are still honored in their shrines, but another current has entered the room. This current is Buddhism, and it brings with it books, images, rituals, architecture, and a style of thought that will change how the court understands itself. The story of the arrival is told twice in the old chronicles, and the two accounts politely disagree on the date. One tradition says that the king of Pakche, a state on the peninsula, sent a gilded bronze Buddha statue, sutra scrolls, and a letter to the Yamato court in 538 AD. The other account places the gift in 552 AD. Either way, the package crossed the straits with monks and artisans, and it caused a stir. Some families at court were captivated by the beauty of the image and the dignity of the scriptures. Others warned that foreign gods might anger the native deities, kami, who guarded the harvest and the throne. The most active patrons were the Soga, a powerful bloodline inclined toward continental learning. Opposed to them were the Mononobe and the Nakatomi, who managed the traditional rites and were wary of a new cult coming with unfamiliar books and strange words. For a time, the Buddha went from house to house like a contested guest. When plague or crop failure came, the opponents said the foreign icon had insulted the old gods. Temples that had been started were dismantled. When peace returned and the Soga gained the upper hand, new halls were erected. The feud culminated in the late 6th century when Soga no Umako defeated Mononobe no Moriya in battle. The victory cleared the way for lasting patronage. Soon, a temple named Asukadera rose in the Soga heartland. A large bronze image, known today as the Great Asuka Buddha, took its place there. It was likely cast by a master named Tori, whose style showed a fine knowledge of North Chinese Y sculpture. It was the first time an image of this scale stood in a Japanese hall, and it brought with it the sense that this new faith could be as grand as any rite the islands had seen so far. The translation of fashion into politics belongs to one remarkable figure. He is known to us as Prince Shotoku. Born in 574, he served as regent to his aunt, Empress Suiko, from 592 until his death in 622. In those years, he gave Japan a template for state governance that drew from Chinese models but spoke with a Japanese voice. He supported the temples and monks with a seriousness that silenced many doubters. He is credited with founding Shita-no-ji in Osaka, which honored the 4 heavenly kings, protectors of the Buddhist sphere. He sponsored Horyuji at Ikaruga, a sprawling complex with a 5-story pagoda and a golden hall, started in 607 and revered today as one of the world's oldest wooden temple complexes. He invited sculptors, tile makers, and carpenters to work in service of a new architectural language. Yet, Shotoku's hand was most powerfully felt in protocol and on paper. He introduced the cap and rank system in 603, which used colored head coverings to signify merit and service, rather than just birth. It wasn't a pure meritocracy, and the noble family still held the best seats. But the idea that offices could be classified and awarded according to ability was a new and useful fiction that made governance more predictable. The following year, he issued what we call the 17-Article Constitution, 604. The word constitution can be misleading. It was not a legal code in the Roman sense. It was a set of guiding principles, a moral and political mirror for officials. It opened with a call for harmony, which meant peace among the court factions. It urged ministers to submit to the sovereign, advised them to consult each other before acting, and praised the triple jewel of Buddhism, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, as the source of truth. Diplomacy became a stage for this new confidence. In 607, and again in 608, ambassadors traveled to the Sui court in China. One of the letters is famous for a line that angered the Chinese emperor and delighted later Japanese readers. It referred to the sender as the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun rises, and addressed the Chinese ruler as the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun sets. It was a clear act of equalization and an early example of Japan formulating its status by adopting Chinese forms but refusing a subordinate seat. The missions brought back books, calendrical knowledge, Buddhist images, doctors, and a sense that a well-organized court should have ministries, registers, and capability tests. A government school in the capital taught the classics. Monks copied sutras. A state that had written little was now starting to write as a matter of routine. These changes did not sweep away the old world. Shinto priests kept their shrines in order. The court cultivated a sun-like approach to religious equilibrium. When a great temple was erected, it was often put under the nominal protection of a nearby kami. This habit of seeing the Buddhas and the native gods as partners rather than rivals created a blended practice that would persist for centuries. The high god Hachiman, for instance, would in time come to be revered as a protector of the Buddhist law. The arrival of Buddhist art transformed the look of power. The old haniwa, standing on the slopes of the tombs, gave way to pagodas and image halls. Roofs were covered with heavy tile, and reliefs on temple bells told stories. A walk through Horyuji, or Asuka-dera, in those years gave the sense that a literate and pictorial civilization was taking root among the rice fields. The influence of all this learning soon moved beyond Shotoku's lifetime. In 645, Prince Naka-no-Oe, who would later become Emperor Tenji, and his ally, Nakatomi no Kamatari, overthrew Soga no Iruka in a palace coup. This act broke the Soga's dominance and cleared the way for a series of radical edicts known as the Taika Reforms. The Taika Reforms, starting in 645, proclaimed that all land belonged to the emperor, reorganized the provinces under appointed governors, announced plans for household registers and tax quotas, and called for the construction of a planned, grid-patterned capital city. The documents echo Chinese codes. What Prince Shotoku had formulated as virtues and aspirations was now being laid out as administrative law. A court that once ruled through kinship and the Kofun was learning to rule through office and paper. Buddhism also offered the court a more abstract kind of legitimacy. The old claim that the imperial line descended from the sun goddess did not lose its power. It gained companions. The ruler could now say he governed according to the Buddhist law, that he supported charitable works, and saw himself as a wheel-turning king who brought order to the world. Writing underpinned all of this. The court adopted Chinese characters and began keeping records with a meticulousness that would have stunned a Yamato leader from a century before. With writing came calendars and era names, tax rolls and registers of free farmers. Literature came too. In the space of a few generations, the islands moved from mounds that spoke with earth to documents that spoke with ink. If you stand at the edge of the Asuka fields in a late afternoon, you smell the damp soil and straw. In the distance, a temple tile roof catches the sun and flashes like a fish turning in a stream. Behind you, the low hump of an old Kofun reminds you that power once sat in stone chambers beneath the earth. Before you, the eaves and lines of the pagoda point skyward. The court is learning to make its claims in new materials, to project its future in wooden halls, painted images, and ranked offices. From the quiet rooms of Prince Shotoku, you step toward a capital about to be planned on a wide plain with straight streets and temples that will dwarf anything seen so far. Imagine a wide plain surrounded by low blue hills. A broad north-south avenue cuts through the fields like a plumb line. At its northern end stands a palace with vermilion pillars and white plastered walls. On either side of the avenue, the land is marked out in neat rectangles of streets and quarters. This is Heijo-kyo, founded in 710, Japan's first fully planned capital city. It was built on the Yamato Plain to be a stage for government and a workshop for a new kind of civilization. Heijo-kyo was not created by winding lanes that wandered as the years allowed. It was measured out and plotted like a carpenter's square. The planners borrowed the idea of a grid from the great Chinese capitals and then made it their own. The main avenue, called the Suzaku-oji, ran straight to the southern gate of the palace. East and west markets were located in balanced positions. Inside the palace complex, the great audience hall faced south, out over the city. On ceremonial days, the emperor sat on a raised dais in the hall, and below him sat the ministers, whose ranks were rigid with colored caps and formal robes. This was politics as choreography, and the building itself instructed everyone where to stand and when to bow. Behind this spectacle was a dense new order. For the previous generation, the Yamato leaders had been writing down how they wanted the country to work. The Taiho Code 701 and the Yoro Code 718 compiled Chinese legal ideas and Japanese practice into a system of ministries, ranks, courts, and provincial administration. Land was to be registered and distributed among households. Taxes were to be paid in rice, cloth, and labor. Provinces were mapped and given governors who reported back to the capital. Roads were improved and supplied with post stations. We still remember this as the Ritsuryo order, law and regulation made into a framework for the entire archipelago. Coins jingled in the purses. In 708, the court minted the first official copper coin, called the Wado Kaichin, a proud thing based on Tang models. What set Nara apart from everything before was the scale of religious patronage. Buddhism had already bloomed in the capital into an urban forest of temples that framed the skyline and how people thought about the state. Two great temples stood near the palace as pillars of influence: Kofukuji, the temple of the Fujiwara family, and Yakushi-ji, dedicated to the medicine Buddha. The most ambitious project of all time arose under Emperor Shomu, who reigned in the mid-8th century. An epidemic of smallpox swept the islands in the 730s and 740s. Shomu responded with a vow that the entire nation would be bound under the Buddha's protection. In 741, he ordered a system of provincial temples, kokubunji, to be built in every province. At the center of this system stood Nara, with a peace within its walls and a goal that almost defied common sense. Inside the great complex of Todaiji, the court erected the Daibutsu-den, the hall of the great Buddha, to house a single image of Vairocana, the cosmic Buddha. The statue itself was cast in bronze and gilded, a seated figure about 15 meters tall. The amount of copper and tin required for the work was staggering. In 752, after years of casting, patching, and gilding, the statue was consecrated in a ceremony that drew ambassadors and monks from China and India. A Shinto god was also invited to protect the work. Todaiji and its great Buddha became a symbol that the state could be both pious and monumental. The nation gathered into one image. Near Todaiji, the court kept a treasure house called the Shozoin. This long storehouse, built in a simple log style, but the items inside are a poem to the expanse of the Silk Road. There are glass bowls from the far west, a lute shaped like those played in Persia, brocades with foreign patterns, and carved rhinoceros horn. The Nara court did not sail to Samarkand, but the world came to its doors by many hands. Literature found its own voice in Nara. The court completed the Kojiki, 712, and the Nihon Shoki, 720, creating a past that explained the present. At the same time, provincial geographical gazetteers, the Fudoki, were compiled, collecting local myths, place names, and resources. Most prized of all is the Manyoshu, the great poetry anthology compiled near the end of the 8th century. It holds love songs, laments, travel poems, and odes to the moon and the plum blossom. Nara taught the court how to make laws, but it also taught the language to sing. Daily life in the capital was busy, practical, and more international than one might expect. The Kentoshi missions to Tang China came and went with the seasons, carrying students and monks who wanted to see the great monasteries and libraries across the sea. The monk Ganjin, blind from hardship, finally reached Nara in 753 and founded Toshodaiji. All of this was not cheap. The Ritsuyo state needed rice and labor from the countryside to build the halls and pave the roads. The system of equal land allocation worked on parchment, but less well on the ground. Over time, noble families and large temples gained tax exemptions and began accumulating private estates called shoen. The tax base thinned. Power also had its dangers inside the walls. The Fujiwara rose as masters of court politics. In the 760s, a gifted monk named Dokyo grew close to Empress Shotoku and rose with incredible speed. It was said an oracle from a distant shrine hinted that he should sit on the throne himself. The court was outraged. The mythical bloodline from the sun goddess could accommodate much, but not a monk in the imperial chair. The empress died in 770, and Dokyo was sent away. The lesson was clear. The court needed the temples, but it did not want them deciding who ruled. Emperor Kanmu, a strong figure who would later decide to leave Nara behind, learned that lesson most fully. By 782, the capital felt overcrowded and tangled by its own clergy and families. The court had achieved its dream of a permanent seat and learned the price of it. Emperor Kanmu reasoned that a move would restore energy and diminish interference. The first step would be made to a new location at Nagaoka, and then to a wide basin a little farther north that would adopt the hopeful name of Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. But to leave Nara was not to forget it. The grid, the ministries, the poetry, the coin, the great Buddha that caught the sun when the clouds parted after the rain, all of it would be carried into the next city in the minds and habits of the court. Life in Nara worked because thousands of ordinary tasks matched the grand ideas. The law codes promised a country verified by written records, and the capital made that promise visible. Officials filed reports on narrow wooden tablets called mokan that archaeologists still find in the palace drains. They list rice deliveries, threads of coin checked and resealed, cuts of cloth levied as tax, even the names of horses sent to the post station. Within a few generations, the islands went from mounds speaking with earth to documents speaking with ink. Nara was not just a city, it was a laboratory for the state. Most people did not live in palaces. They lived in wooden houses with tamped earth floors and deep eaves that cast a shadow you can still feel on your skin when you walk an old street in summer. A typical meal was rice, if you were lucky, millet if you weren't, salted fish or river eel, pickled greens, and a soup thickened with bean paste. Fermented seasonings were already part of the cuisine. People brewed sake, made bean pastes, and learned to draw flavor from thyme and microbes. The markets sold lamp oil, salt from coastal salt pans, combs, needles, and string, as well as the ink tablets that stained the fingers of students in provincial schools black. The temples had baths, and the street corners had public wells. Fire was a constant threat, so the blocks kept large barrels of water ready, and neighbors knew who would man the bucket chain. Clothing spoke rank at a glance. The cap and rank rules, begun in Asuka, were refined in Nara and assigned colors and trimmings that signaled standing and office. A high official could be seen from a distance by the color of his robe and the gleam of the ornaments on his belt. The religious city within the city never slept. Monks in the 6 schools of Nara debated fine points of doctrine in the lecture halls. At Todaiji, the Keigan school taught a vision of a universe where all things interpenetrate, like jewels in a net. At Toshodaiji, the great monk Ganjin, blind from the storms of his many attempts to reach Japan, taught monastic discipline with a firmness that finally gave the islands an established rule for ordination. Shinto moved in its circles and often met Buddhism at the shrine gate without friction. At the Kasuga shrine, deer wandered among the lanterns as if they owned the place, because in a way they did. They were considered messengers and behaved accordingly, curious and bold. The court invited the god Hachiman from Kyushu, to act as the patron of the Great Buddha Project, an elegant way of saying that the old and new guardians were colleagues. Festivals marked the year, and the Shunye rites at Nigatsudo, Todaiji complex, began in the 8th century with nighttime fires and water drawing that still fill the darkness with an exhilarating glow. Education had a clear place. The State Academy taught the sons of the nobility the Chinese classics, history, and law. Provincial capitals managed schools for the sons of the local elite. The roads that linked the capital to the rest of the archipelago were more than dirt tracks. The government maintained post stations at set intervals where a messenger could get a fresh horse and a meal. This system linked to Daizifu in Kyushu, which served as the Western administrative center and the window to the routes from the continent. The Manyoshu is one of the best windows into life beyond politics. It preserves not just courtly verses, but the voices of soldiers, minor officials, and women whose names would otherwise be lost. A widow grieves with a clarity that makes the centuries vanish. A princess writes of the scent of plum and the embarrassment of a sleeve wet with unexpected rain. The anthology shows how a city that adopted Chinese characters made them do Japanese work, starting the long process that would lead to the syllabaries of kana. Trade in Nara was both local and global. At the east and west markets, a housewife haggled for fish, while a merchant from a provincial port sold woven mats and salt. At the same time, objects from afar were present in the capital. The Shosoin treasury next to Todaiji held the gifts and regalia of Emperor Shomu. Inside are faceted glass bowls that shine with patterns common in the lands of Persia, musical instruments whose forms were borrowed from Central Asia, and stenciled cloths that seem to have traveled many hands along the Silk Road. Nara may have been located on a farming plain between the hills, but its thought wandered from India to the desert and back. For all its grace, the city experienced strain. The ideal of the equal field, the allocation of rice fields to free farmers, was faltering. On paper, the system was balanced. In practice, a river broke an embankment. A winter fever robbed a household of its laborers. A temple claimed tax exemption for a patch of fields, and a noble family added another estate to its protection. The ideal of the equal field gave way to the Shoen estates, where patrons offered security in exchange for loyalty and a share. This drift began in Nara. It would change landholding for centuries to come. The city also discovered the price of success in religion. The court needed the temples as schools, hospitals, and moral anchors. It did not need abbots telling emperors what to do. The Dokyo affair in the 760s showed how thin the line could be. A charismatic monk reached for political power through influence at the top. The court pushed back hard and removed him when the opportunity arose. Emperor Kanmu took the lesson from this confusion and decided that a clean slate would help. The solution would be a new capital and a deliberate move away from the density of the Nara temples. But this doesn't diminish Nara's achievements. It established the habit of a capital that looked like a capital. It created a bureaucracy that, for all its flaws, could count, build, and move. It turned Buddhism from a curiosity into a framework for civil life, without turning its back on the old sanctuaries. The new capital began with a walk on a field and a set of neat lines in the mud. In 784, Emperor Kanmu tried to move to Nagaoka, but found the site unsuccessful. In 794, the court entered a new city under bright banners. The new name was Heian, the capital of peace and tranquility. It was a prayer written as a mailing address. Heian was a city made by a carpenter's square and a poet's ear. Kanmu did not want a repeat of Nara's problems with temples, so he moved them farther away. Two men gave the Heian era its spiritual architecture. Saicho traveled to China, returned with the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, and established Enryakuji on Mount Hiei above the new capital. Kukai delved into the rites of esoteric Buddhism. He returned with mantras and mandalas and founded a monastery on the Koyasan Plateau. Between them, a new balance formed. Heian had a court of ministers and a court of monks, and the two courts learned to greet each other without tripping. The city acquired a mind as well as a map. In 805 and 806, new teachings took root. In 810, the court weathered a palace coup and emerged with a stronger sense of rules and ranks. The legal code that began as an import from Tang China became rooted in local use. In the palace quarter, a new style of noble house emerged. Shinden-zukuri estates set their main halls on pillars above white gravel, open to gardens with ponds and islands. Art answered the architecture. Artists worked in the native Yamato-e style, which had a clarity and color suited to the climate and light. Calligraphers turned the written word into a performance. The writing was a work of art as much as a message. Language itself changed in Heian. Chinese characters remained the script for official documents and law, but courtiers and court ladies worked out two phonetic syllabaries from the larger system: katakana, which started as neat notes in the margins of sutras, and hiragana, which would blossom in private correspondence and literature. Hiragana flowed in loops and curves that suited poetry and diaries. With these syllabaries, the language could speak its own music. The new era's earliest great poetry collection, the Kokin Wakashu, was compiled in 905 and included a preface that explained what a poem should do. It should take the heart by surprise and set a small truth before it. From then on, a person at court had to be able to answer verse with verse, read the mood of the room by the rhyme, and understand that a plum branch or a mention of the autumn moon could carry an opinion as clear as spoken speech. Music and ritual filled the calendar. Gagaku, the elegant court music, blended instruments and melodies from China and Korea into a stately repertoire. Sumo wrestling evolved into a mixed entertainment with offerings to keep the gods happy and the realm peaceful. Omnio-do, the court science of yin and yang, guided the selection of days for ceremonies and house building. Diplomacy changed course. In 894, the court abolished the official missions to China. The Tang dynasty was suffering its own troubles, and the sea passage was expensive and often unfavorable. Scholars, led by Sugawara no Michizane, argued that Japan had learned enough abroad and should now polish what it had. This decision did not close the door. Private trade continued, but the court turned its gaze inward, and the culture that followed took on a distinctly local character. Politics developed its own internal weather. The Fujiwara family skillfully married their daughters into the imperial line and acted as regents while the emperors were young. By the mid-10th century, they had a near monopoly on courtly influence. The emperor remained sacred and central. The Fujiwara learned to stand close and speak quietly into the right ear. Daily life in Heian had the rhythm of a city that knew how to be beautiful without forgetting that roofs leak in the rain. Villagers came into the capital, and the capital sent itself back out on the roads. In the provinces, the Shoen estate took form as a practical answer to the tug-of-war between lists and reality. A great family or a temple offered tax protection in exchange for loyalty and a share. In the short term, everyone benefited. In the long term, these umbrellas grew into a canopy that prevented the sun of central government from reaching the ground. The court loved polish. It also loved small, precise feelings. A taste took root that later generations called mono no aware, the gentle awareness that things pass. It is not abstract. It means that the sight of the first cherry blossoms can bring a grown courtier to tears without shame. It means the light on a tiled roof after a storm is as worthy of notice as a prince's birthday. This is the glory of Heian, as important as the silk robes and the formal ranks. Stand for a moment by the Kamo River on a spring morning. The air is cold enough to nip slightly. Wild ducks rise from the reeds because someone laughed too loudly on the bank. Up the slope, the long line of the palace wall gleams in the early sun. Behind it, a clerk is already grinding ink, and a lady is already selecting which layers of robes suit the weather. Walk into Heian around 1000 AD, and the first thing you notice is how deliberate everything looks. Streets meet at right angles. Canals keep their manners. Even the shadows under the palace eaves fall in neat rectangles. The city had learned to move in time with its own sense of grace. And that grace reaches its full voice in a world that later readers know through a long story about a shining prince. The story is fiction, but the life it reveals is not. It is a record of a society that decided beauty and ceremony were not a luxury, but a method for getting through the day. Start with a noble house, arranged in the Shinden-sukuri style. The main hall faces a garden with a pond and small islands. Covered walkways cross the water so that robes do not drag on the damp grass. Sliding doors and reed screens control what can be seen and by whom. Rooms open not into corridors, but into views. Clothing carried half of this attention. Court women dressed in layered robes called junihitoe, 12 layers, though the precise number of layers varied with the season and endurance. The point was not the weight, but the color. The layers were chosen in combinations that matched the month, a practice called the colors of the season. Men wore long, trailing trousers and lacquered jackets topped by tall caps that declared rank. Cosmetics made the face a kind of calm mask. Faces were powdered with fine white powder. Eyebrows were shaved off and painted higher on the forehead. Teeth might be blackened as a sign of adult dignity. The script for conversation was poetry. A courtier who could not produce an elegant 31-syllable waka on the spot did not belong in the bright pavilion. Lovers, rivals, and cousins exchanged verses as naturally as we send messages. A flower left on a doorstep carried a poem. A reply that came too late or chose the wrong seasonal image could offend as surely as an insult in prose. Blinded screens and mats regulated privacy. Ladies and their attendants remained behind the screens. A man might address the screen and receive an answer from a woman he had never seen, and it would be proper. Secrecy was part of the charm. Religion permeated the calendar. Monks from the great mountains of Hiei and Koya performed rites for the realm. But something new was brewing. The idea that sincere belief in Amida could lead a person to salvation took deep root among courtiers who were acutely aware that life was beautiful and fleeting. Books were emerging everywhere. They were copied in hand onto paper, colored with dyes and sprinkled with mica so that the page had its own light. The story that became the symbol of the era was written in parts by a woman serving the empress. Murasaki Shikibu began writing her long tale of Prince Genji, beautiful and flawed. Her peers and literary rival, Sei Shonagon, wrote a book of lists and observations she called the Pillow Book. Together, these two books allow us to hear the women whose writing was not restricted by the need to quote Chinese classics in every paragraph. The court women used the flowing script that came to be called hiragana, and in doing so, they gave the language its most native voice. The arts grew as naturally as a shadow. Painting in the native style evolved into picture scrolls that told stories in long horizontal ribbons. A century later, artists would turn Murosaki's chapters into scenes for these scrolls and show interiors with the roofs lifted off so you could peek into the room without intruding. Craftsmen perfected a method of joining many small pieces of wood to create large statues, which meant that tall Buddhas could be lighter and more stable. Even games felt refined. Children floated paper butterflies at spring festivals along winding garden streams and caught cups of wine set afloat, composing impromptu poems before the cup reached them. With all this sophistication came blind spots that could be seen from the other side of the river. The court relied on provinces governed by men who were sometimes better at letters than at tax collection. The system of public land allocation continued to fail as temples and noble houses multiplied private estates and brought free farmers under their protection. Ox-drawn carts rolled confidently through the capital, while bridges on provincial roads sagged or disappeared. The court loved to polish the center and ignored the edges, and on those edges, men who knew how to ride and shoot a bow were beginning to make a name for themselves. For now, these men were hired muscle for the noble estates. In time, they would become something else. None of this troubled the guests at a moon-viewing party on a clear autumn night. A screen was set out near the veranda to catch the reflection of the full moon in its gold leaf. Cups were kept small because too much wine would spoil the perception of the haiku they would all write later. It is a collective discipline. The clerks who balanced the rice ledgers, the gardeners who raked the gravel into new patterns, the carpenters who repaired the galleria roofs before the rainy season, the readers who whispered a chapter to a friend behind a screen, all sustained a culture at its peak. Walk the straight avenues of Heian in the late 11th century, and you sense the city projecting a brave face. The palace still holds grand audiences. The Fujiwara still glide to ceremony in ox carts. Poetry circles still debate whether the moon belongs in the second or third line of the waka. Yet behind the screens and the lacquer, there is a second Japan that is louder and more practical. A Japan of estate managers, mounted archers, and toll collectors who don't recognize a court edict unless it arrives with men carrying man-high bows. The long arc of the era is bending away from the writing brush and toward the bowstring. The causes begin in the fields, not the palaces. The equal field system that looked so clean on paper wore out. Great temples and noble houses gathered private estates called shoen and won exemption from many taxes. Security purchased loyalty. The estates needed sturdy men to guard the rice stockpiles, settle quarrels, and escort shipments to port. These men were called bushi, or samurai, at first simply servants who served, and they began to look to each other, more than to the capital, for orders. A samurai earned income by protecting the harvest and taking a share of it. The court attempted to hold the reins. It appointed provincial governors who were supposed to rule for limited terms. Many governors quickly learned that the surest way to meet their quota of rice and cloth was to hire local force. In the north, the frontier brought a different challenge. The Emishi peoples in the Tohoku region knew the land better than any tax inspector. Campaigns in the 11th century against strong families there created heroes with bows and a taste for rough camp food. Minamoto no Yoriyoshi and his son Yoshie forged reputations in wars that taught several lessons at once. A disciplined unit of mounted archers can outlast a larger force, and loyalty is easier to buy with future land rights than with pretty titles. Inside Heian, the court changed shape to accommodate these realities. The old Fujiwara method of ruling through marriage is continued, but a new invention was added to it. emperors began to retire and rule from behind the scenes as cloistered or retired emperors, or insei. The first notable example was Emperor Shirakawa in 1086, who found that life worked better when he wore a black monk's robe and moved to a separate palace where he could issue decrees without the formality of the throne room. This arrangement was a marvel of courtly compromise. The reigning emperor kept the sacred luster. The retired emperor handled the finances and personnel. Ministers bowed to both and tried to guess which bow carried more weight. The new balance weakened the Fujiwara's control but did not restore order. It multiplied the doorways to power. When disputes over land or tolls flared up, both sides hired muscle. Monks from the great temples of Mount Hiei and Kofukuji marched into the capital carrying portable shrines on poles, a way of saying that a god was visiting and the court had to listen. Processions of warrior monks were not uncommon. The sight of a gilded shrine rocking on the shoulders of men carrying staves is one of the less serene images of the Heian period. Taira no Kiyomori understood this new world early. He won battles for the court, built a base by the sea, and made alliances with powerful merchants. In 1167, he took the title of Grand Minister, the first warrior to rise so high. He intermarried his children into the imperial line and watched his grandson become emperor. Kiyomori knew where to place a storehouse and who to bribe at the port. He was direct and not humble, and he made enemies. The reaction came from all sides: plots from the court, protests from the temples, and smoldering resentment from rival warrior houses. The Minamoto had not forgotten old defeats. In 1180, a prince named Mochihito issued a call to arms against the Taira. He was heavy on rhetoric and light on immediate effect, but he gave the opposition a voice and a banner. Within months, monasteries and eastern warrior bands were exchanging letters with men who signed themselves Minamoto and who were ready to march. Meanwhile, the logic of the estates reached its next stage. Men who had long defended a district as unofficial masters were given official titles of estate steward, jito, and constable, shugo, offices that would soon become the backbone of a new order. The court that once trusted a graceful exchange of letters now faced a ledger of favors owed to men who could burn down a granary or save it, depending on how they were met at the gate. Stand in a village south of the capital on an autumn afternoon, a few years before the serious fighting starts. The steward sits on a veranda with his armor unlaced at the sides while he listens to a tenant's complaint about a boundary marker moved by a neighbor. He settles the matter with a quick ruling and a promise to send men to put the stone back in place. Behind the house, a blacksmith works the bellows and turns a strip of iron into a saddle stirrup. In the fields, people cut rice and stack it on drying racks. A boy practices shooting a short bow at a chalked post. The age of knights has already begun. The steward will travel to the capital next week with a gift for his lord, and then to a temple to present a prayer tablet in thanks for the harvest. He lives between worlds, and his children will lean more toward the world that answers quickly and keeps its swords oiled. Writers of the time began to tell the story in a new voice. War tales circulated in the capital, first as oral epics passed from minstrel to minstrel, and then as written books. They lingered on the brave gesture that could not save a man, and the quiet irony that undercut a victory. By 1180, the tinsel was peeling. The palace had moved and moved back. The Taira wore the crown by proxy. The Minamoto were gathering in the east in severe numbers. The temples sharpened their arguments. The court still composed an elegant poem. But the merchants in the inland sea were learning that the man who tallied the cargoes best was a Taira clerk. The generation that learned to read Genji was now learning to read battle formation on a wet plain. All the pieces for a national civil war were on the board. Rivers that had once carried only boats with festival lanterns would soon carry men with arrows clenched in their teeth. Bridges built for processions would bear the weight of horses galloping in the dark. The elegant city on the plain had created a culture that could sing of the moon forever. It had also created a class that could fight all winter without complaint. The war that ended the Heian era began with a rumor in a hot summer and ended with a child emperor falling into the sea. Between those moments, the country learned what it meant to be ruled by men who could ride all night and shoot straight in the rain. Minamoto no Yoritomo, a survivor of earlier defeats and exile in the east, raised his banner in the hills of Izu and was immediately chased into the dark at Ishibashiyama in September 1180. He escaped through bamboo and bad weather with a handful of men and headed for Kanto, the land of wide rivers and tough farmers who knew him. Yoritomo did what he always did best. He built patiently. He courted the great families of the East, promised them offices and land rights, and established his base at Kamakura, a coastal bowl of hills and inlets that felt defensible even in the mist. The battles moved like weather fronts. In late 1180, the Taira army set fire to Nara after the monks there supported the Minamoto. Flames leaped from temple to temple. Todaiji burned so fiercely that the bronze of the great Buddha bent and flowed. The loss shocked the court and left a scar on the city that did not fade for years. To win, both sides had to break the things everyone loved. Kiyomori died in early 1181, and much of the old fire went with him. His son Munemori took over the clan and held Kyoto, but the Taira's grip began to loosen. The next 2 years brought famine across the country. The Minamoto name now covered several branches that did not always agree. A cousin, Minamoto no Yoshinaka, rose from Kiso in the mountains with a fierce band of followers and swept toward the capital along the old Nakasendo road. His men won hard battles in the valleys and reached Kyoto in 1183. The Taira fled west with the child emperor Antoku and the sacred regalia, the sword, the mirror, and the curved jewel that tied the throne to the age of the gods. Yoshinaka took Kyoto like a storm and then behaved like one. Yoritomo in Kamakura decided his cousin had to go. He sent his half-brothers, Noriyori and Yoshitsune, west with disciplined eastern troops and a clear order: oust Yoshinaka and then turn on the Taira. Yoshinaka was chased east and killed. The Taira still held the inland sea and the coasts. To break them, the Minamoto needed generals who could move faster than letters. Yoshitsune was that general. In early 1185, Yoshitsune crossed the narrow straits with a night maneuver that involved his men lighting fires on their ships to appear larger than they were. The Taira, thinking a huge fleet was upon them, took to their boats and pulled away from the shore. Yoshitsune landed and fought them from the beach. The final battle, Dan no Ura, occurred on the 24th day of the 4th month of 1185. It was a day of wind, current, and choices. The Taira had more ships. The Minamoto had better pilots and an understanding of the tide. At first, the Taira had success. Then the current turned. A key Taira ally betrayed them and told Yoshitsune which ships held the court and the regalia. Realizing the day was lost, the child emperor Antoku's grandmother gathered him in her arms and jumped into the sea. Others followed. The sacred sword sank. The mirror and the jewel were later recovered. The war ended on the water, but the creation of the new order happened on the roads. Yoritomo did not participate in any of these battles. He stayed in Kamakura and sent out letters that changed lives. After Dan no Ura, he secured the right from the court to appoint military governors, shugo, and estate stewards, jito, across all the provinces. This meant that the people who kept order and collected taxes reported to Kamakura. In 1192, Yoritomo received the old, high-sounding title of Sei Taishogun, shogun. The word that mattered was not in the title. It was the place. Power no longer lived where the emperor sat. It lived in a low-lying seaside town beneath wooded hills, in offices that smelled of salt and ink, in courtyards full of horses and quiet men with ledgers. If you want to feel the end of the Heian world, stand in Kyoto in the late 1180s and listen. The city still holds its grid, but from the east, the sound you hear is the steady thud of hooves on a hard road. Yoritomo built this world with careful patience. He kept his distance from court ceremonies and created offices that matched the needs of men who lived by the bow. 3 boards mattered most. 1, the Mandokoro, administrative board, handled finance and day-to-day governance. 2, the Samurai Dokoro, board of retainers, maintained order among the vassals. 3, the Monchujo, board of inquiry, handled lawsuits and appeals, a sign that the government of the sword planned to rule by paper as well as steel. Around these boards was a network that made Kamakura strong. Vassals, called gokenin, swore a personal oath of fealty. In return, they received land rights that gave them a reason to answer quickly when Kamakura sent for them. The shogunate government appointed jitto, stewards, to collect rents, and shugo, constables, to keep the peace. These offices cut across the old rights and titles. A proud family in Kyoto might own an estate on paper, but if the Kamakura steward took charge of the harvest collection, the flow of rice obeyed the steward. This was the Quiet Revolution. Yoritomo died in 1199 after a fall from a horse. With him went the simple clarity of a single founder. His son Yoriyie took the title, but quickly found that his wife's family and his father's lieutenants had ideas of their own. He was followed by his younger brother, Sanetomo, a gentle poet who managed to hold on mainly because he let others guard the doors. In 1219, Sanetomo was assassinated on the stone steps of Tsurugaoka Hachimangu Shrine by a relative who stepped out of the shadow with a blade. The main Minamoto line was gone. Power did not collapse with it because it had already shifted to the family that guarded the throne from behind the screens. The Hojo clan had been building a durable grip from the start. Hojo Masako, Yoritomo's widow, cut her hair and took vows after his death, but never stopped ruling. People called her the nun shogun and meant it as a compliment. Her father, Hojo Tokimasa, and then her brother, Yoshitoki, acted as regents for the boy shoguns, who were shoguns in name only. They found small princes in Kyoto to wear the title and left the work to Kamakura. The capital didn't enjoy being commanded by a city it had once looked down on. In 1221, the retired emperor Go-Toba tried to break Kamakura's power. He issued a call to arms in Kyoto. The Jokyu War was Kamakura's response from the east. Hojo Yoshitoki sent a swift army down the old Tokaido road. It routed the imperial forces and entered the capital with the steadiness of a flood. The court was humiliated. Go-Toba was sent to a distant island. Kamakura set up a permanent headquarters in Kyoto called the Rokuhara Tandai to watch over the court. The victory cemented the dual order forever. Kyoto kept the rights and the bloodline. Kamakura kept the law and the horses. Law under the Hojo became more than habit. In 1232, Hojo Yasutoki issued the Joi Code, a set of rules and principles for settling land disputes and crimes. It was practical and concise. It instructed judges to seek the facts, weigh testimony, and remember that custom held authority when the text was silent. It cared more about sustainable practice than subtle theory. The code sat on the desks of Kamakura officials for generations and gave Japan its first solid warrior law. Kamakura didn't hold together without blood. Vassal houses that grew too big were pruned back. The Hojo could be ruthless and pious in the same week. The Hojo regents ruled with a light hand in rhetoric and a firm hand in practice. Hojo Tokiori reduced the showmanship in government, avoided titles, and made decisions in quiet councils. The faiths of the time took a new shape that suited the temper of the warrior government. Zen teachers arrived with a taste for Chinese tea and the discipline of long sitting. Enzai, a monk who studied on the continent, founded Jufuku-ji in Kamakura around 1200 and wrote a small book extolling tea. Dogen, who studied deeper in China, taught a quiet sitting that sought insight without embellishment. Meanwhile, Pure Land teachers offered a path of faith to people who didn't have time for scholarship. Honen preached reliance on the name of Amida. Nichiren focused on the Lotus Sutra with a force that alarmed officials. Culture did not disappear beneath the armor. It changed rooms. In Kamakura, the warrior house was arranged for work. Music in this world was simpler and more direct than in the Heian salons. The plays of temple festivals and street troops began to evolve into the art form later known as No. The great war tale of the era, the tale of the Heike, was being shaped by blind minstrels who traveled with lutes. The shogunate built a map of posts that made the whole island a little smaller. The Rokuhara Tandai watched Kyoto and kept the court polite. In Kyushu, a regional headquarters called the Tandai coordinated defense. Favor and obligation took on the permanence of law. Yet, for all its confidence, Kamakura sat on restless ground in a literal sense. Earthquakes shook the city. The Hojo could face nature with stoicism and enemies with swift knives. Then, a new letter arrived. It came across the sea from a ruler in a city most Japanese had never seen. It demanded submission. The letter came from Kublai Khan. The men in Kamakura had never faced a question quite like it. The first warning did not come with sails on the horizon. It came folded in silk. In 1266, a letter reached the Dazaifu in Kyushu from Kublai Khan, ruler of the new dynasty in China. The message was direct: recognize the new order and send tribute. Kyoto preferred phrases about the imperial bloodline. Kamakura preferred more practical responses. Neither city offered tribute. In 1275 and again in 1279, when ambassadors came too close with the same request, the shogunate executed them. It was a risky clarity. The first fleet sailed in 1274. It mustered in Korea with soldiers from the Mongol heartland, Chinese sailors, and Korean crews. Even when the numbers in the chronicles were reduced to a more sober size, the force was like nothing Japan had ever faced. It was an army that fought in formation, used drums and horns to keep the rhythm, and knew the art of gunpowder. Kyushu was the entry door. Post at Dazaifu watched the west. Along the coast stood beacon fires, ready to send smoke by day and fire by night. Local lords mustered their men and headed toward Hakata Bay, the best landing spot in northern Kyushu. The command ran swiftly through the structure Kamakura had built. Constables gathered provincial troops. Estate stewards brought their vassals. Monks prayed all night and forged spear tips by morning. The first blood fell on the islands guarding the straits. Tsushima and Iki suffered heavily. Their garrisons were small, their beaches open, and the defenders learned at close range how much pain a mass of archers could inflict when supported by a shield wall. Survivors sailed to Kyushu with tales of unfamiliar weapons. One account spoke of bombs that burst with a jagged crash and iron shrapnel, a frightening novelty that the chronicles would later call thunder-cracking bombs. It wasn't magic, it was gunpowder, fire, and metal. In November 1274, the fleet entered Hakata Bay. The picture looked wrong to Japanese eyes. The invaders advanced in tight blocks, shields forward, arrows ready, drums loud enough to make the ribs rattle. Local warriors rode out to issue a challenge for single combat and found no polite reply, only volleys of arrows and a swift rush. By night, the beach was no man's land, from a human perspective, and dangerous from a practical one. A fleet that rules a coastline must sleep at anchor. It also must survive the weather. After dark, a squall blew in. How strong it was is still debated. It was strong enough to push ships into each other and onto the shore. It was strong enough to snap rigging and throw men wearing more armor than was good for swimming into the water. When the clouds cleared, the commanders looked at their charts and chose the cautious path. They sailed out of Hakata and set course back toward Korea. The defenders called it a victory. The invaders called it a reconnaissance with lessons learned. Kamakura didn't wait. Orders were issued to fortify the bay with a stone wall. People dragged stone from quarries and fields and laid it into a long, low barrier that stretched for miles along the curve of the beach. The wall stood man-height, with a step too steep to make for easy climbing. In the summer of 1281, the Second Fleet came like a weather front that never ended. This time the attack came in two parts. The forces from China were late. The crews were tired. The season was approaching the storms. In the 7th month, a typhoon hit the straits. It did not reason, it simply beat the life out of the fleet. Anchors dragged, hulls rammed each other, masts broke. The storm tossed wreckage onto the shores of Iki and into the coves around Takashima. The next morning, the beaches were choked with planks and men who could not swim. The Japanese fighters moved across the shallows and finished what the weather had started. Later generations named the storm the Divine Wind, Kamikaze. The word carried gratitude and pride. It also carried a story that was simpler than the reality. The defenders had trained, built, and learned new tactics in hard, unglamorous work. The wall at Hakata was not divine. It was stone. The shogunate spent its authority holding the ships away from the beaches. Now it faced an internal struggle it hadn't anticipated. A war that brings new estates enriches the winners. A war that repels an invader leaves most fields exactly where they started. The vassals who spent years on defense and patrol duty expected compensation beyond kind words. The money to reward them was not there. Debts mounted. In 1297, Kamakura issued a debt cancellation edict, Tokusei-rei, to give struggling warriors relief, a desperate measure that angered the creditors and proved the treasury could not answer with coin. The same loyal network that had stood firm in the storms began to unravel when the weather cleared. The shogunate spent its authority holding the ships away from the beaches. Now it faced an internal struggle it hadn't anticipated. A war that brings new estates enriches the winners. A war that repels an invader leaves most fields exactly where they started. The vassals who spent years on defense and patrol duty expected compensation beyond kind words. The money to reward them was not there. Debts mounted. In 1297, Kamakura issued a debt cancellation edict, Tokusei-rei, to give struggling warriors relief, a desperate measure that angered the creditors and proved the treasury could not answer with coin. The same loyal network that had stood firm in the storms began to unravel when the weather cleared. The shogunate spent its authority holding the ships away from the beaches. The Hojo regents and many of their relatives perished together at Toshoji, the family temple, ending a line that had governed the country for over a century. Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto with a plan he called the Kenmu Restoration. He was going to rule directly. He was going to strip away the layers of stewards and constables and return the lands to the court and the old owners. The plan looked good on paper in a palace hall. It looked thin in a barracks yard. The warrior houses were used to practical rites. They preferred a share of the harvest to a seal on a scroll. When they brought petitions to the new government and found the courtiers reading them like poems instead of orders, they began to reassess their loyalties. Two names mattered most in that reassessment: Ashikaga Takauji and his brother Tadayoshi. They had fought for Kamakura, switched sides when the wind blew, and helped overthrow the Hojo. Takauji expected a place near the throne. He received less than he thought. In 1335, unrest in the east gave him a reason to raise troops again. He marched out of Kyoto as a loyal general, and then turned. He took the city, briefly forced Go-Daigo to flee, lost the ground, recaptured it, and fought his way to the coast at Kobe. There, in 1336, he defeated the emperor's best forces in a heavy summer fight and returned to Kyoto to install a new order with the composure of a man who understood that capitals reward the people who bring the rice and keep the peace. Takauji named a new emperor in Kyoto and established himself as shogun. Go-Daigo retreated to Yoshino in the south with the sacred mirror and jewel, and declared that he remained the true sovereign. For over 50 years, Japan lived with two courts, one in the old capital, one in the hills. This era is remembered as the Nanbokucho, the time of the north and south courts. The new shogunate took its name from the alley in Kyoto where it settled. Muromachi was a district of workshops and townhouses. It became the seat of government with the quick confidence of a person who puts their desk by the window that catches the good light. The Ashikaga did not try to rule from Kamakura. They kept the court in sight and made sure to please enough of its great families to soften the legitimacy problem. At the same time, they redrew the map of warrior governance. The Kenmu Code, 1336, set out rules for land and rank among the fighting houses. The Shugo, who once mustered men in an emergency, now managed arrests, collected tax rice, and sometimes consolidated several provinces into a personal domain, beginning to look like a lord all his own. The roads felt the change. Couriers who once rode for Kamakura now directed their horses toward Kyoto. The markets in the capital bustled with a mix of courtly taste and warrior money. Zen temples stood with open gates for men who slept in armor and now wanted clean lines and quiet runes. The Ashikaga discovered that tea could be politics. A well-set tea gathering in a temple allowed rivals to sit close, look at a beautiful bowl, and speak quietly to the host while rain drummed on the eaves. The luxury of earlier centuries did not disappear, it was repurposed. The artist who would once have gilded a hall in Heian now painted sliding doors for a warrior mansion and learned to deliberately leave empty space. The old taste did not die, it learned to live with iron. The Ashikaga line found its most confident voice in Yoshimitsu, who came to power in the late 14th century. He reunited the North and South courts in 1392, a feat his predecessors could not manage, and made Kyoto shine again with a style that borrowed from the court and the temple in equal measure. The peace Yoshimitsu made did not reverse the changes that began with Kamakura's fall. It confirmed them. Japan had learned to live with a court that blesses and a warrior government that governs. If you want to see Yoshimitsu's mind embodied in wood, travel to the north of the city, where he built a villa called Kitayama. On its grounds, he set a shining pavilion that sat over a pond and caught the light, so that even a practical visitor paused. That pavilion is known as Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, and it was not just a display of wealth. It was a lesson in balance. Courtly taste could live beside warrior necessity, and both could bow before the quiet clarity of the temples that taught restraint. Patronage reached the theater and changed it forever. A father and son, Kanami and Zeami, took the lively temple performances and street plays and refined them into dramas that could hold a hall in silence. These no plays became an evening school for men who spent their daytime giving orders and signing receipts. A warrior could learn from a play that control could be more persuasive than noise. The taste that formed around Yoshimitsu had a simple beauty that rested the eye. Zen temples shaped it. At Daitokuji and Nanzenji, monks laid out dry gardens, kare-sansui, where raked gravel and a few stones could symbolize islands and distant seas. Tea during this era moved from the temples to private gatherings. Murata Juko, a tea master, championed a style that did not need dazzling bowls or gold screens. A small room, a rough cup, a single flower, and good conversation could be enough. This modesty suited a class that had learned to feel the wind on night patrol and count the hours to dawn without fuss. Trade gave the new order its cash and its pace. Clan houses set up offices in Kyoto where the work could be done. The start of the Shoin-zukuri style, which favored straight lines and clean space where a scroll and a flower could teach more than clutter, began here. The peace Yoshimitsu made did not mean quiet for every house. The power of the provincial constables, or shugo, grew as they learned to collect tax and call men to arms without waiting for Kyoto. The history of ancient Japan, which began with gods stirring the sea and villages pressing cords into clay, closes its ancient chapter in rooms where men in simple robes write clear commands and then step out to a garden to look at rocks arranged as tiny continents. The country had learned how to argue with itself without breaking, and how to transition from one way of ruling to another while keeping the songs and the sanctuaries intact. The Muromachi shogunate took the governance, but it was wise enough to leave the culture to Kyoto, and that made it strong. Cracks appeared in the plaster. A succession dispute in the shogun's house got messy. Two great families in the capital, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, gathered allies from across the country and glared at each other across bridges that a generation ago served as the site of poetry contests. In 1467, trouble broke. Fighting started in Kyoto in the year the calendar named the first year of Onin. The war that followed lasted over a decade and left the city scorched and grim. Houses burned in entire blocks. Families who kept careful genealogies found their records in the ashes. Temples became forts because their walls were thick and their gates were well made. The shogunate lost the habit of command. In the provinces, local lords who had sent troops to Kyoto found they could rule at home without waiting for a letter that never came. The result was an era of many suns, bright, hot, and close to the earth. This era produced its own communities of confidence. In Kaga province, leagues of believers gathered under the banner of a Pure Land temple and drove out their professional rulers. Elsewhere, town councils learned to fence their quarters and set their own watches. Castles climbed hills that rose above the rice-rich valleys. The dungeon of a castle began as a watchtower and became a symbol that could be seen a day's ride away. Peasants didn't have to ask which lord held the valley when a new tower stood above it like a finger. Even in the heart of this uncertainty, the art did not fail. It adapted. Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, who loved objects more than order, withdrew from politics. He retreated from politics and turned to building and collecting. He built the Silver Pavilion, Genkakuji, by a pond in the Higashiyama district and filled the rooms with screens that shimmered like morning mist. He failed to stop the Onin War. He shaped a culture that could find meaning after it. Ink painters like Seshu traveled to China and returned with a method that showed a mountain and a river with the fewest brushstrokes necessary to make the scene breathe. Gardeners created spaces that could calm the mind for an hour. By the late 15th century, the country that had once been ruled by a shogunate by the sea had become a patchwork of strong regional houses, proud towns, and temples that could raise thousands of men if they chose. The emperor remained a figure of right in Kyoto. The Ashikaga shoguns remained in Muromachi for a while longer. But the real decisions were being made in rooms where maps were laid out and where the talk was of levees, roads, and harvest collection. If you walk through Kyoto at dusk in this era, you can still smell the old city beneath the ashes. Behind a screen, a no play is being rehearsed. A tea gathering has left the scent of charcoal and the clean taste of hot water in a small room. A monk places a stone a hand's length to the left and steps back to look again. Across the river, carpenters raise the frame for a castle that will tell the valley who now speaks for it. The past of the sanctuaries and chronicles is readily available, as is the future of the walls and plans that will carry Japan into the years of unification. The era that began with grace ended in war. It was the beginning of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring provinces.